So welcome everybody tonight's live stream of Carl Ronner's a conversation around Carl Ronner's encounters with silence, and we had a little technical difficulty, but we seemed to iron that out. And we like to begin each evening with a song, so let's do that. Come on my knees to lay down before you, bringing all that I am, longing only to know you, seeking your face, and not only your hand. Find you embracing me just as I am. And I live these songs to you and you alone. As I sing to you, and my praises make your home. To my audience of one, you are Father and you are Son. As your spirit flows free, let it find within me a heart that beats to praise you. And now just to know you more has become my greater reward. To see your kingdom come and your will be done. I only desire to be yours, Lord. So what could I bring to honor your majesty? What song could I sing that would move the heart of royalty? When all that I have is this life that you've given me. So Lord, let me live for you, my song with humility. And Lord, as the love song of my life is played, I have one desire, to bring glory to your name. To my audience of one, you are Father and you are Son. As your spirit flows free, let it find within me a heart that beats to praise you. And now just to know you more has become my greater reward. To see your kingdom come and your will be done. I only desire to be yours, Lord.
Thank you, Josh.
Yes, sir. Take this off. Oh, Well, Chris, would you give us, a couple sentence summary of where we've come thus far? Who's Carl Ronner and what are we a part of?
Okay.
It's, I think, blasphemous to try to say anything brief about Ron, given the way that he worked. I think we're looking in these prayers at a kind of, we're overhearing, being let in on conversations between this priest, theologian, and God, and he's not editing himself. He's allowing us to see the rawness of that reflection, and he's finally let God in on even the praying itself, right? Even into the depths of his heart, and is offering that to us as as a gift. I mean, I think there's a really fine, and we've brushed up against this a few times, and this is not what you asked for, Josh, but we brushed up against it a few times, that Jesus says outright, right, when we pray, we're to enter into a closet and shut the door. And then we have a Christian tradition filled with people letting us overhear their prayers. And I think we should sit with that. Like, what does that mean? What is happening there? Jesus himself, his own prayers are overheard. Right. And I think that Ronner has learned the secret of how to let us in on the secret without exposing what should not be exposed. And that to me is testimony to the integrity of his praying.
Well said. Tonight we've been reading 2 chapters at a time, and tonight we're going back over God of law and God of my daily routine. And in this first chapter, first one we're looking at, it seems like he's touching the nerve, exposing the distance between. He talks about God's law, and if I make myself, if I give myself to this, I can find your presence in that. Even if something as simple as the Ten Commandments, right? Um, to say that we're not supposed to lie reveals something about God's being, God's truthfulness. Um, to say that we're supposed to be, committed to this one God reveals something about God's passionate love and covenant faithfulness. But then he seems to be wrestling with, but how does that play out in my relationships in the church with ecclesiastical authority?
Mhm.
Because they're putting rules and regulations on top of one another that's talking about the length of my clerical robe.
That's
And I
one of
just
my
want
favorite
to,
passages in the book. Why don't you read that
yeah.
passage where he talks about the robe? Because I think that is tremendous.
Um, okay, where's that?
I can find the page number if you want.
Yeah, where's he talking about his cassock? Is it the passage right before this?
It's in that chapter on God of law. I don't have my book in front of me, but hold on a second.
Well, I was going to read this one. On the bottom of 39, he's talking about this tension, and he says, "How often have I found out that we grow to maturity not by doing what we like, but by doing what we should? How true it is that not every should is a compulsion, and not every like is high morality and true freedom.
Hmm.
Conscious willing is found even in infants, but consciously accepted obligation is the sign of mature man. Oh, grant that I may not always belong to the class of the infants who continually want to play the game differently, who are never satisfied with the rules as they are. Jason, what do you hear there?
um, One of the things I hear that I was just thinking about, Chris mentioned last week, and I think the week before, about Ronner feeling the church like indigestion in his guts. And so what immediately I think of are, I was recently at a funeral for a former parishioner who used to make my life hell complaining about what I wore in worship. Yeah. And so, yeah, there's, my Birkenstocks with my alb for, I think both of these chapters for tonight, I think there's deep parts of it that people who do this work as their vocation can identify with on just a human level. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, Josh, the quote is on page 41, where he talks about the gown and then the how long or short my cassock is. Middle of the page 41.
Arbitrary judgment. But it's not like that in the case of the laws. Originating from human authority, the prescribed cut of the clerical gown in itself has nothing to do with the holiness of your being. I can serve you as a priest no matter how long or short a cassock I wear. You are not present in that law, just as you would not be present in its opposite. Why then must I seek you in precisely this way when you could just as well be found in another? So he's addressing God and saying, you're present in your law. That makes sense to me.
Mhm.
But how am I supposed to find you and to serve you, to obey you faithfully in this seemingly arbitrary clerical law?
Yes. I think this chapter, I don't know, Marty and Jason can weigh in, but my sense is this for American evangelicals and people who are gathered at the edges of that tent, this will be probably the hardest chapter in the book to make sense of, because I think we have a pretty disordered, pun intended, relationship to rules and law. Like, I'm hesitant to try to label what it is or to try to sum it up, but I think there's a kind of mad incoherence to the way that we relate to law. And for Ronner, though, there is real confidence that the law is good. And when he says the law is good, he means first, of course, the Lord's law, that the word of the Lord, Psalm 19, Psalm 119, the law the Lord has given is good. It purifies the soul. It is a delight. And like the blessed man in Psalm 1, Ronner desires the law of God. All of that coming to bear in the Ten Commandments. And I think a lot of the people I've known best, the people that I've loved and have loved me, have, again, a very fraught relationship, even with the Ten Commandments. They tend to see them at sometimes as essential to life in the world, to the life we're called to live, and at other times as contrast material for the gospel, that those laws are there to tell us what God has saved us from. But God has not saved us from the law, right? God has not saved us from himself, and he's not saved us from his law. He hasn't saved us from the Ten Commandments. And Ronner is clear about that. So I think that's probably a discussion worth having on its own terms, that until we agree with him about that, I'm not sure we're going to be able to track what he says about the other, which is that there are other laws that are not from God and are not in themselves holy. They are arbitrary. And that's the passage that you just read, right? The length of my clerical garb doesn't matter one way or another. And there, as Americans as well as evangelicals, and I sometimes wonder which of those identities is really defining the other. I think we really can't make up our mind what we think about how God relates to that kind of order, especially when we get down to the level of the arbitrary. And it's, among other things, this chapter is remarkable to me in that Ronners has enough clarity to even say these things, that he can even recognize this for what it is and name it is already an achievement. It's one that I don't think we should rush past to what he's doing with it. I think it's worth sitting with the wonder that he can see it at all, that he can recognize law is good, actually. Right? Law is gospel. When that law is the Lord's law, it is the law of liberty in the language of James. And that somehow even laws that are not from the Lord can be taken up into what the Lord in his freedom is doing. That is an astounding achievement, I think.
Yeah, I so on page 40 and then on to 41, it's hard for me to make clear, even to myself, what I mean by this question. Let me put it this way. In the commandments which you yourself have given, it's almost as if you were actually present. You have made them your commandments, precisely because that which they contain is the expression of your holiness and goodness, because we would be unlike you if we did not love what you command. Our rejection of your commandments would be ultimately a rejection of you yourself. And Marty, you can speak to this. So reading this chapter, what I'm thinking is Barth's emphasis on reordering law and gospel as gospel and law, that once you understand that God has freed you for joyful obedience, you can be grateful that God has a moral purpose for your life. And it's precisely that joy, not the command. It's the joy in the command that allows you, that empowers you to discern between the spirit and other spirits. I think it's the language he uses in this chapter also.
If you put the imperatives of law before the indicatives of grace, they will always be conditional and you will never get grace. The nature of the indicatives of grace, that God is gracious and loving and in fact is the fulfillment of the law, then leads the context within which the working out of the law is simply that which is the imperative of what one does because one has been loved, unconditionally given life. The unconditionality of the law becomes, as T.F. Torrance will say, Jesus becomes the ground and grammar of the law. So to say, what is the law? If it's separated from Jesus, then it becomes some human capacity to harness, corral humans that loses the very nature of what grace would do. But once you understand the nature of the indicative of grace, even in the Old Testament, the Lord, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and faithfulness. Once you discover that the God of the Old Testament is not a binding people into imprisoned ways of being, but in fact is the liberator, then suddenly the nature of what the Jews call the first commandment, I am the Lord your God who rescued you, who brought you out of the house of bondage, the house of slavery in Egypt, is God's act of grace. And that what follows is simply, now act like it. You've been set free. Be a people. Love me. Be with me. Be with one another. Respect, honor, cherish the dignity of living life together. And suddenly law is the dropping of the blinders, the dropping of the bits, and actually beginning to dance, to live in life with one who's awakening in you is what it meant to be fully alive. When people say, I just wish I could be more like Jesus, I say, don't try and be like Jesus if that's a law for you. Ask rather, what does it mean for you to be more who you are because you're in the presence of the gracious one who loves you and brings into you a life that allows you to be released. And hear the word freedom as it appears in the opening sections of this, that the Spirit who brings freedom is not freedom from, it's freedom for one another, because we recognize the fullness of God for us. And we no longer have all this exterior sense of law as something that we're supposed to fit into, but rather, like falling in love, we discover that we are those who are cherished, seen, and that the most appropriate use of the word should is simply, if I promise to do something for you, I should obey it. Everything else is could. The work of the Spirit is the coulddness of life, the possibility of loving in ways we never dreamed imaginable. There's a section in a book, it was actually a woman's devotional, it's on simplicity. Anyway, the point of it was, every day the Spirit comes and says, here's an opportunity for you to do something. And if we take it, the Spirit says yes. And if we don't, the Spirit says, here's the next one. Here's the next one. Here's the next one. And I love the beauty of the Spirit always giving us the liberty of not following a law of how to do things right, but rather the opportunity to, having been loved, to express that with one after the other opportunity in every aspect of our life. This is the structure of Paul's epistles. Here's what God has done for us in Christ is the first half. And then it goes on to say, now be those kind of people. And that is gospel and law properly ordered.
So related to that, in the comments here, Joel, if it's the Joel, I think it is, he does the Church of Canada proud. But he says, so he's mimicking Jensen, and Joel says the law is whatever is revealed in Christ, having first been revealed in Israel, which is not different from what you're saying, Marty. And that's a clever way of putting it. There's a question here, Chris. Do you think the concept of joyful obedience is more difficult to understand for Christians or non-Christians looking at Christian theology?
I don't know that I could answer it at that level of generality. I think, so much of it will have to do with how we're catechized and discipled and formed, and how we've cooperated with the grace that's in our lives. I mean, there's so many dynamics at play, obviously, as whoever asked the question knows. I think probably what the question is driving at, and follow up if I'm mishearing it, I think what the question is driving at is, are we actually making it harder for ourselves in our churches by the way we're talking about obedience? And I think the answer to that question is absolutely. I think virtually everything we say about obedience and commandment and law and grace, I think virtually everything we say muddies the water, because we're not doing what Ronner does, which is to cut to the truths that are anchors. The Lord's word is pure and good and life-giving. The law itself is not what we're saved from any more than we're saved from the Father. What we're saved from is what in our sin the law has become for us, what uses we've put it to, and therefore the condemnation that we've reaped and also wreaked onto others. So I think we need those kinds of clarifications first before what we're going to say next starts to actually sound good. But I mean, obviously I can't speak for everyone I know, much less all the people I don't. But it seems to me we are very often talking as if what we mean by grace is having been set free from God's own law and from obedience. Right? And when you're that muddled, like, what are you going to say that doesn't make it worse?
It's like David Bentley Hart's joke about how much of Protestant Christianity is the premise is that Jesus has freed us from the burden of being Christians.
Right. I've actually never heard that before, but yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to name here. Right. That thankfully God in Jesus has given us a way out of actually having to be what he made us to be, do what he told us to do, and love as he loves. Thankfully, Jesus is there to keep us from having to be Christian. I mean, I really do think, Obviously, no one believes that as such. But when you kind of sum up all of our kind of incoherent, half understood beliefs, half articulated convictions, that's pretty much what it amounts to.
Yeah, and I think maybe another way of, I mean, it gets to that question is, I think what Ronner is exemplifying in these prayers is that to have an understanding of the law as in the sense of joyful obedience, you do have to know God. Like the law can't really be known apart from a
Yes.
relationship. And that's and the story of the Exodus is a reminder too that just because the God who rescued you doesn't mean you're going to make it through the wilderness without complaining.
But that's true. But there's also a way, so I agree with Marty. I mean, this is not a point of disagreement with anything that's been said to this point about the gospel and law in relation. But of course, pedagogically and catechetically, like the way we come to know the gospel requires the law to be our school master, right? To guide us into it. And I think that's true, of course, of the Lord's law, but it's also true of what Ronner here is calling arbitrary laws, man-made laws. There is something about living an ordered life and taking that yoke that prepares us to recognize the yoke the Lord is offering to us. So there are all kinds of ways in which this is true, but some of them obvious, even though I'm not sure we see them until something forces us to pay attention to them. But in other ways that are not so obvious, like the passage, perfect love casts out all fear. And obviously we would all agree on this point. I think that the fear that's being named there is specifically fear of judgment, fear of condemnation before God. But it casts out all fear, not just that fear, not just the fear of being condemned by God, but all the fears that go with it. But here's, I think, something that's hard for many of us to get our minds around, that expulsion, the having the fear cast out, is essential to the way of becoming one with that love.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's no way around the experience of fear into perfect love. Like we have to be led that way. You don't go right from Egypt to the promised land. You have to pass through the wilderness. And there are some fears we should never experience. And if we do experience them, it's unjust and evil that we should be delivered from and healed from. But there are some fears that are natural. Like this is, not just Ronner, but the whole Christian tradition, really, that there are some fears, including fear of God in a certain way, that we need in order to bring us into the presence, to find that the one who's there as our judge, the one whom we've been fearing naturally and rightly, turns out to be this lover who's blushing with delight in us, to go back to the image that Marty gave us last week. And if we get that out of order, then we not only keep people from arriving at perfect love, right? We actually make it so that when we start to talk about love, it has no energy. There's no heft to it. It's a cliche for no resistance given to your desires, no resistance given to whatever your basest instincts are. So like I do think that the confusion runs that deeply. You might be tempted to think there are legalists and there are libertines and people who overemphasize the law and people who overemphasize grace. But my read of folks I've known is that we do both at the same time, depending on what the topic is, and whether we're talking about our children or somebody else's children, whether we're talking about our sins or somebody else's sins, and whether we're talking about a personal individual problem or we're thinking about what we think of as a problem with a group of people. And part of what I love about this chapter is the challenge it puts to all of that noise.
I think Jesus was always attacked for not following the law when in fact he was the very embodiment of the law. And the nature of fear, as you put it out, is the very root of addictions, particularly
Mhm.
religious addictions. The power of addiction is denial. And if you can deny that you are trying to be helped by something that is actually destroying you, you will keep feeding on it. And so people keep going to church, largely feeling guilty before God, ashamed of who they are, and all that. And yet there is something of just showing up that says we keep covering over, and therefore we are not following the law by any of the attempts to follow the law that are the forms of religious addictions, which always say comply externally with those things that are expected of you, and you will be accepted. And so the obvious things of drug and alcohol, that there's something obviously they're destroying you, is not nearly as obvious as people who get shut into their world, afraid of the shame of being seen, afraid of the fear that somebody will finally have the reason to reject this person. And so to say our greatest addiction is probably acceptance. We are more willing to lie to have people accept us than anything else. And it's a broadly plagued thing. And so the law of wanting to be accepted, which is what God's grace gives to us, in the pursuit of it, we deny it. And therefore we can't follow the law of love because the law of fear has come to dominate us in such a way that we can't even see the prison in which we have entrenched ourselves. Karl Barth in volume 3.1, when he talks about the falsehood of humanity, says it probably is harder for Christians because the first falsehood is just to deny that Jesus is the one to whom we really need to be obedient, because we come up with so many options that look like they're for him, but they're not. And so we're always struggling with that, where the non-Christian doesn't worry about that. And so they have a kind of freedom to be, a freedom for joy that the Christian does not enjoy, simply because the falsehood that begins with denying that Christ is the one who truly loves us leads to all the other, what he calls the little falsehoods, where in every case we're then trying to justify or whatever, that become the many forms of falsehood. And so there again, law has become something externalized that destroys the internal as it becomes a prison, and we die in isolation and separation, and it's tragic.
Yeah. Can I push in on this point just a bit that Marty's raising here, and just kind of try to give a more granular read of it? I'm going to give two examples for people. One is, again, if we think in terms of that polarity, like legalism and license, right? A kind of hyper grace or legalistic model. I grew up around people who took great pride in being holy, and I've often, probably in a sinful way, certainly in a rude way, said that we might call those people Pharisees, but that would be an insult to the Pharisees. We might call them Pharisaical, but that would be an insult to the Pharisees, because they really took their legalism seriously, right down to arguing about Christmas trees and whether or not you should or shouldn't wear an undershirt under your white buttoned up shirt as a man, and whether or not women could or couldn't wear pantyhose because those were like pants, and pants are a men's apparel, and it's an abomination. If you have women wearing men's apparel, then in a generation you've lost all distinction between male and female. This is why God sent the flood. I mean, that level of crass legalism, right?
The temptation to make inappropriate jokes right now is so high.
Yes. And here's the thing. Those very people were unbelievably licentious, yes, but also libertine in other areas of their life, right? So, and Marty, you will have run into this many times, I'm sure, in counseling sessions, in which I think everyone, you know what, you've been out in the ocean and what it's like to stand there and to feel the different temperatures of the water. Like you can stand, you can feel how the surface is hot even, but your feet are chilly, and you can feel the different movements as well. And of course, the deeper out you get, the more there are cross currents. I think that's what the human life is. That's what a community life is. What I was trying to name earlier is that I think precisely the places where you're most likely to get the legalism, right there, around it, under it, beside it, there is its opposite, that is an overcompensation for the damage this is doing to your humanity. So that the people who are most legalistic about X, Y, or Z are going to be the least disciplined about A, B, and C, and vice versa. That when you have an over-exaggerated account of grace, you're going to be especially cruel in those areas that threaten what this is doing for you, how this is serving you. And what's needed is not balance, but genuine integration and the kind of sensitivity that recognizes what's called for here is submission. What's called for here is yieldedness. And what's called for here is the freedom of spontaneity. And that the really human life is lived in that constant, always required responsibility. This is what I think Bonhoeffer means by being responsible. You can't.
And it's a better definition of Jesus telling Nicodemus that the Spirit blows where it wills.
I think so.
Like that isn't like, well, who knows?
Right. Right. Yeah. Exactly. And so I think that what we need here is an account that kind of address all of those cross currents at once, right? All of the temperatures of the water at once. And if we're not careful, we will talk about one problem or address, so let's say there's a group that's overstating faith and grace and healing and blessing, and they're exaggerating that message. The mistake would be to think their problem is simply that they're overstating that message. They need to dial that back. Well, what they really need is the integration of the message that they can't see as integral to the goodness of the hope they've seen in this message of deliverance and healing and prosperity. And that's what I think Rahner does get. All of this holds together, right? Opposites coincide. I think this is to think Christologically is to see that all good opposites coincide and all that's opposed to God is overcome. So when you're talking truthfully, there's always this both and many layered nuancing of it's true in this way, it's true in that way, it's not quite true in that way. You have to be careful here. And that, I think, is the only way really to talk well and life-givingly about law. Otherwise, we'll fall into one of those two polarities that actually doesn't address the full scope, the whole complexity of being human needs to be addressed. And one of the reasons I love Rahner, he's not alone in this, obviously, but one of the reasons I love Rahner is I think he has a sense of that, and that we have to talk to speak to all of that as best we can.
So I was going to say we're not limited to Rahner, but where do you see that in this work, where he's doing the dance of holding those things in tension, of, I'm looking towards you in your face in all things. That's what I'm being submissive to.
Right.
That's what I'm being obedient to. So where do you see that?
Well, but I think that's it, right? Like he starts off right. The beginning of the chapter, or the beginning of the prayer, is Lord, you're the Lord of freedom, but you're also the Lord of law. But instead of just having a kind of, dialectic, this and that, he immediately moves to this as that, and this as that in certain ways. This as that in ways true to who you are, not this as that as I imagine it to be. Not this and that in some kind of bland or facile balance, right? But this as that in you. And so then he works his way from that conviction to, of course, your law is good. Of course, your law is life. The word that calls us into being is a command. Let there be, and there is. The call of the gospel, follow me, is a command. And so on. It's a life-giving word. But then he gets himself to this place of, okay, I believe that. I trust you. However, what about all of these knuckleheads I have to submit to? All of these clerics that are making decisions about the gown I have to wear and how long my cassock is. And I can't remember the number, but 2,000 plus paragraphs in the canon codes that I have to know as a priest. And you can hear his weariness in it. Like, what are we doing here? And of course, that calls up all kinds of biblical passages. People that, strain at a gnat and swallow a camel.
Mm.
Right? And they are, what does Jesus says? You'll encompass the whole earth, right? To win one person to your side.
One convert,
Your
make them
understanding.
twice just unto hell.
Yeah, and then what you end up doing is absolutely locking the door against the grace that God is trying to give them. And I mean, Jesus' statements are severe, but they're no more severe than what's already been said by Moses and what's been said by the prophets. Like, Israel is the first to say the Lord is the Lord of the law, and the first to say, and we are people who make that law a burden, who put that law, rather than as a word of deliverance and creation, we turn it into a word of condemnation. Like, that's not a Christian realization. That's not a New Testament realization. Jesus knows it because his people taught it to him. And he, of course, gave it to them as their Lord. So, like, Ronner works his way to this point, realizes, I want to be a man of the church, but not clerical. There are all these rules and all these laws that are arbitrary. How do I inhabit them? I inhabit them in you, for you. Right? And he's acknowledging it's his vocation. We don't have time to do it tonight, but I'd love, in another life, another timeline, to kind of branch out from every one of the prayers to essays Ronner wrote on theological topics related to it. And one of the ones that comes to mind here is a really famous open letter he did about celibacy in the priesthood. And you probably have read it or heard of it, in which he defends celibacy for the priesthood, but not from a legalistic place. He says, I think the church should be very magnanimous about those who joined, gave their life to the priesthood and then found that they feel they need to be released from it. Like, he's in no way heavy-handed about it. But he says, at the end of the day, to be human is to live with limits. And to be human is to have an agency that must decide for a future it cannot fully see and live by those decisions to the glory of God, however painful it becomes. And without that, we lose hold on what our calling is and what it means to be human. And I think that is what I see him doing here, to say, of course, these rules are arbitrary. But if I fought those rules, I would fight my way into another set of arbitrary rules, or into a just as arbitrary set of non-rules. That I said I was going to give two examples. One was the holiness I grew up with. The other one was, the tightest ecclesial structures I've ever encountered are house churches. I don't know if you guys have ever been around house church movement, but, and then, of course, this is a broad, sweeping statement, but like you would, I think experientially what I've found, the people who are most rigid about church structure are the ones who are the first to tell you that there is no structure to the church. Right? Just like the people that are most dogmatic about their doctrine are people who will tell you on the first page, these are not creeds. This is not a revelation from the Lord. This is just a summary of what the Bible says.
Those people have so much liturgy, there's no room for the Spirit, but this is how we do it, and do not stray from the
right. And that's what I'm trying to get at, right? That when you get down to the real complexity of how our lived lives go, often what's actually playing out is the opposite of what we're saying. Like, so we're talking about how, some of the most narcissistic leaders I know are the first ones to tell you, we have to get away from narcissistic leadership. We can't have the sage on the stage. Like,
he has names he'll provide later.
No, I will not, actually. Anyway, I'm ranting, but I hope you're feeling kind of where it is that I'm taken by this chapter, at least.
Yeah.
I think the question in counseling, and I say to people, if you're trying to find out what is the right thing to do, it's probably the wrong question, because somebody ends up judgmental of somebody else and everything falls apart. It's always a lose-lose if somebody has to be right and somebody has to be wrong. The question to ask is, what is the loving thing to do here? And that's what we ask in the face of Christ. Jesus, what is the loving thing to do here? And there is an adaptability by the Spirit in every situation that never can collapse into a form of the law that is external and rigid, but rather is the law of love, the law of the Spirit that works out in a way that Rahner, in a sense, articulates here.
Yeah.
It's hard to get people to learn that, but I think that is the direction that even Rahner is pointing to here.
Yes, and I completely agree. And the irony is, the paradox, more than irony, is that I think the way you learn that best is by submitting to things you don't have to submit to, and then realizing, because I mean I've lived this. I think we all have lived this, probably in multiple spheres of our lives, but submitting to that, a rule you don't have to. At first, it's, I don't have to submit to this. Why am I doing it? And it feels like a violation of your agency, your identity, your freedom. But at some point, if you really are doing it, it dawns on you, I'm doing this. I didn't have to do it. I am free to do it. You know, and this is why Paul can circumcise one and not circumcise another. It's why Paul can say, when I'm serving those people, I go by those rules. And when I'm serving those people, I go by those rules, because in Christ, I'm free for both, right? Back to Marty's point, not free from them. I'm not an individual. Like, I'm a person in communion with both of them. I'm free for both of them. And I can enact the law, the spirit of the law, either way. Circumcision doesn't matter. Uncircumcision doesn't matter. What matters is new creation. And the way that new creation comes to us might come by way of circumcision. It might come by way of uncircumcision. Either way, it will be obedience to the leading of the Spirit, and will still require that same submission and yieldedness and trust and readiness to live the way of the cross. So, like, that's what I think starts to kind of clear some of the smoke or the fog away from these themes.
Listening to you, Chris, I'm thinking, so you recently had a conversation about Bonhoeffer and the scandal of the text, but you were at the beginning emphasizing the importance of not doing theology apart from specific texts, not generalizing, right? Yeah. And I'm thinking a couple of Sundays ago, we're just doing Luke's prologue in worship on the Sundays of Advent, and how Luke is quite detailed about Zechariah and Elizabeth being righteous,
yes,
without blame, perfect under the law, and and so then and then, like, you and I have talked about Jensen and the problem with slogans before, that so much of our theology when it comes to law and grace exists on this, it hovers above any specific texts.
Yes.
And then also over time, the slogan loses contact with what it was actually talking about originally.
That's right.
And so we've got, like, disconnect in two different directions. And if you attend to a text like Luke 1 or a prayer of Karl Rahner, it forces you to make more concrete statements.
Yes, and Luke 1, that's Luke 1 and maybe Luke 2 with it. Like, just sit with those texts long enough and it will all start to come clear, right? All that we're discussing narratively, just, it's there, right? Zechariah and Elizabeth are both fully faithful.
Well, and what I left unsaid, like Jensen's thing about the slogan, it's like frequently what I hear when people want to throw the Luther's Seymour back at me is a justification for the way that they're living. And and I'm like, well, wait, like there's Zechariah and Elizabeth, like,
yeah, but narratively, notice how Zechariah is faithful, but when the moment of truth comes, he's not ready for it. He is in his priestly routine, just as Isaiah was, and he doesn't have the response that Isaiah does, even though he's faithful too. Elizabeth is faithful, and she does have the response, right? Joseph is faithful. He has the right response. We're told nothing about Mary. Certainly she was not unfaithful, but nothing is said in Luke about Mary being blameless.
Mm-hmm.
But she responds with that yes. Then when we get to Simeon, you have again a man of the system, a man of the institution, who is able to see what has to be seen, the opposite of Eli, right? So he's in that role. He's there. Eli could still bear witness to ask this voice, ask this presence to identify himself. But Simeon sees, right? This is it. This is the one my eyes have seen. But there's also Anna, who's there, who seems to be not. I mean, she's not part of the infrastructure. She's an institution unto herself, right? And some of what Luke is doing there narratively is showing us that faithfulness doesn't come in one cut.
Yeah.
Right. But don't you dare think that those who keep the law somehow are by that kept from being like Elizabeth, like Mary, like Joseph, like Simeon, any more than those who don't keep it are somehow kept from seeing what Anna sees or what Mary sees. Like, this is what we mean by the freedom of God. He's free in those structures, those man-made structures and rules, as well as free outside of them. And you can know the freedom. And this is what Ronner is saying. I can be free as a priest if my bishop is a terrible person.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got an unbelievably rigid account of how we're going to have to dress as priests. The Lord's freedom works there too, just like it works in the prisons that Paul ends up in, just like it works, when Maximus has his tongue cut out and his hand cut off by the patriarch, or John of the Cross is thrown into prison by, again, a bishop. These are all kind of reminders that the Lord's freedom is genuine. He transcends his own transcendence, to use Jensen's phrase, which means he can work within structures that are tight, as well as outside of them. And there will be saints in both locations if you pay attention, because he's doing what he does. And those of us who are called to work inside the system don't need to be afraid of it. We need to be awake. We need to be responsible in the Bonhoefferian sense, but we don't need to be afraid of it.
And now to the next chapter.
Let me. So the end of this chapter, Ronner prays, "In no command do I belong to men, but to you, and he who belongs to you is free. You are not the God of laws, because you will that we should serve the law. You are rather the God of the one law, that we should give our love and service to you alone. And I pray also, as you wish me to pray, for all superiors you have placed over me, that their commands may never be anything else but the appearance and fulfillment on earth of the one great law of loving you." I really like his prayer, this chapter. And I was thinking earlier too, Chris, when you're talking about the world that you live in, the world I live in, what I frequently get are comments like, "Well, I don't really believe in God, but I'm basically a good person." Or I don't really believe in God, but I follow the commandments. And so there's just this. It's not just law and gospel promising and command that we separate. It's the this relationship with God is a command.
Yeah, that's the point Marty was speaking about.
Yeah.
In Jewish tradition, the first commandment is, "I am the Lord." Now, it's not about what that's the state of things. That's the indicative reality into which you're born, by my word.
Which has always been my frustration with people who want to post 10 commandments in public places and think their job is done. That's
the irony, right? And this is closely related to how we relate to the law. So, one of the things that is obvious here in Ronner is that he's not wagging his finger at us about rules.
Mhm.
He's not saying, Marty, you can wear that cassock. That doesn't matter. He's saying to God in prayer, as much as I hate it, as annoyed as I am by it, Lord, I know you are free here too. And that difference of posture makes all the difference. Like for him to wag his finger at us and say, what you need to do is submit to the rules. Like that's something different altogether from saying to his own heart and to the Lord, I can do this because it belongs to you and I belong to you. Like that's where the difference is made. Right. And we tend to hear it and that's the point of putting the 10 Commandments up in somebody else's space, public space, is an attempt to say, if I impose the rules on you, I won't have to live by them.
Mhm.
If you'll follow them, I don't need to bother with it. Which I mean, it's pretty far from the spirit of Jesus. I don't think you don't have to be especially holy to discern that.
The great irony is that we say that we nail our shame, our guilt, our blame to the cross, that Jesus would take it away. And then that's exactly what we use the law for in the church, to make sure everyone has an appropriate level of shame and guilt and blame to stay in order, right? And Paul says, he nailed the certificate of debt to the cross. Maybe it's just the certificate, not even what it symbolized in a sense, but the whole sense of Paul in Colossians there is you've got all these ways that you're trying to get to God through something other than the nature of the one who is the incarnate God in whom we move and breathe and have our existence. He is the very life of love, as you said, Chris, or as it ends in this section. The law of love is made visible in community. Therefore, as God's holy and beloved people, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another, forgiving one another, and put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. That's his vision of the church, freed from a form of the law that becomes an armor that's supposed to protect, but in fact imprisons and kills.
Yeah, let me put this to you guys as a kind of test. So this is my sense right now as a pastor. Is there are kind of three, and not these three things only, but just over the last few weeks, months, I'm kind of seeing these three points of emphasis. I don't know what to call them really. One is we need, and this goes back, Jason, to that conversation that I had with Stanley on the podcast about sin. It is a great grace to be able to name our sins, to be able to confess them, to know how we are sinning. Psalm 25, the Lord instructs sinners in his way, and it's only sinners that get the instruction. So you've got to know, I've got to know what my sins actually are, not in generalities, and not go straight to the moralistic categories that have been layered over all of us. Like, don't tell me about lust. That doesn't count. I want to get to something specific, like something that it belongs to you, that is causing you to resist the will of God for your life and the life of the people around you. So we have to get past the moralism. But I think the grace of being able to confess our sins is desperately needed. Another is the delight in obedience, to want to know what the Lord wants from us and to do it, and to delight in doing it. And then third, and I think this is the hardest for people to hear.
And I would add for mainline people, like the belief in the agency of God to discern that.
Yeah. I mean, none of this makes any sense. Like you smart aleckly said a moment ago, I believe in God, but I don't believe in God, but I follow the 10 Commandments. Well, no, you don't, because the very first thing the commandments say is, I am the Lord, right? So if that's nonsense to you, then everything else is nonsense. It has to be, right? Then I think this third is harder to name, and this is what I'm putting on the table for all of you to respond to, and that is this difference, Jason, that I talked about in Wichita between the shallow heart and the deep heart that I'm getting from Vey and others in the Christian tradition as well. I think yesterday, the epistle yesterday, Philippians 4, the peace of God will guard your hearts. Ronner's sermon on that passage, he says our hearts need to be arrested. They need to be put in jail. And he didn't make this play, but I didn't think to make it in the sermon. I missed my chance. But I think there's a time in which there are ways in which what I'm calling here, follow me, Vay, the shallow heart. There are times in which you have to arrest it in order to have rest. You've got to be able to say to your heart. So in the language of the psalm, you have to soothe your heart like a newborn or like an infant babe. And I think we don't know how to do that very well. So because we don't know how to delight in obedience and we don't know how to name our sins, we get caught in moralism. Right? And because we don't know the difference between the deep longings of our heart, which need to be voiced and answered, and the shallow the cravings of our shallow heart that need to be quieted, soothed like a baby, or put in jail. Like that I think is right at the heart of the unrest we're all living with, the anxiety, the depression, the fraying of our lives, I think comes from not understanding the good of the law, the good of command, the good of obedience, and the good of that aimed back at yourself. And to know when to say, because what moralism does is it has you deny in yourself what should not be denied, so that you can give expression to the things that you don't want to have to deny. I become convinced. I don't know if the language purity culture means anything to you. But purity culture is, of course, a kind of violence, but it's a kind of violence in service, not of a puritanical hatred for the body and sexuality, but as a justification for the indulgence of it. That if I establish a purity culture within the confines, all bets are off. If within marriage, everything is allowed, and so I put strict boundaries there, the goal is so that I don't have any boundaries once I'm where I want to be. I'm no longer accountable to be loving and respectful and sacrificial and living canonically. Like, I'm married. What are you going to say to me? Right. That's what I think we have to grapple with that. That's how it seems to me pastorally. So I'd love to hear, I know we're out of time, but what you guys think about that, because we're in different contexts. We're obviously has come to this.
Yeah. I mean, I think I don't know if you meant to, but I think you've bridged the two chapters, the next chapter that we didn't get to, that I think it's precisely our lack of delight in the law that makes it hard for people to experience God in the humdrum of their life, I think is how Ronner puts it.
Yep.
That a lot of our worship is talking about what God is doing other than in the sanctuary. And a lot of our law and gospel talk is abstracted from people's everyday lives. And once you've made the law something to to have Jesus rescue you from, you've put yourself in a position where God is not to be discerned in just the everyday tasks before you.
Yes.
G.K. Chesterton said, "There's no one so reasonable as a lunatic. Everything makes perfect sense to them." And to say there's a certain lunacy of the law that seems to overtake Karl Barth, in a sense, addresses it in his interpretation of Job. The three friends have a perfect sense of the law and spend many chapters telling him all that he's done in failing the law. But it's an abstract law. It's something. And Job just says, my beef is with God. I want to hold God to be God. And that's what Barth says. That's a witness to the truth. And you can be mad at God. You can be disappointed. You can be whatever. And in the end, God says, you have spoken rightly. And that's the law of love. God can even say, complain all you want. I get it. And if you're holding me to being me, I'm good with that.
Yes.
Josh, you have the last word.
So I was just going to say, to clarify for those folks following at home, there was a question in the chat that we will just honor our schedule. So for those showing up next week and doing the reading, we'll read chapter 7 and 8. If we can say something about God of my daily routine, that's fine. But if not, I think we did a good job. Good conversation tonight, friends. So it is night. Take your rest.
Blessings
See
on
you
you
next
all.
week.
Todd, we missed you. Thanks.
Todd, get your grandchild to help you work your computer next week.